This is Inside the UCC Group Leadership in Action podcast with your hosts Laura Butler and Jay Mamie. This podcast will share groundbreaking initiatives by the university and speak with leading educators, business leaders, and entrepreneurs that are paving the way for growth, transformation, and success.
Welcome to the UCC Group Leadership in Action podcast. I am Laura Butler.
And I am Jay Mamie, and I am thankful that you are joining us today for another episode of a fantastic podcast. And Laura, I got to tell you something. Today's show is going to be fantastic because we're going to dive into the dynamics, the ever-evolving, especially now, dynamics of the HR world. What is happening today that, let's say, wasn't on the radar, wasn't on the landscape of the HR industry, the hiring, the recruiting, the training industry 2.5 years ago. So we're going to dive into that. We're going to have a great conversation with a subject matter expert that I'm looking forward to picking her brain and hearing what she's got to say about this particular topic.
Yes, Jay. And as you know, that's my background as well, HR and specializing in corporate training. And this individual has a proven track record for excellence in performance and in her field. So I'm very excited to have her, and I know she's going to be providing some great information.
And Laura, let's introduce our listening audience to our special guest today, our subject matter expert in HR. Charmaine Heslop Dacosta has over 20 years experience as an executive with a focus on maximum service delivery and improving critical business outcomes. She has experience in transformation, integration, and organization development, but she's also recognized as a strategic business partner with the ability to do a number of things: assess situations, craft solutions, build teams, create, organize, and implement efficiencies. And what I think people appreciate about her is her natural leadership skills. She holds a BA in psychology. And she's been honored with a number of different honorees, one of them being the Lifetime Award from Brescia University College in recognition of exceptional leadership. She's also a member of the Society for Human Resource Development and the Association for Training and Development. And during her career, she served on many corporate boards and nonprofit organizations. And currently, she's also the Justice of the Peace. Charmaine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jay.
Charmaine, we're going to dive into your wisdom immediately because we're interested in hearing your perspective on HR and your experience. And so we're loaded up with questions. And my first question is, how has the recruiting process changed over the years, in your opinion?
Great question, Jay. So in a couple of ways. First of all, technology has transformed the recruiting process. So today you have systems such as candidate relationship management, CRM, or employee relationship management, ERMs, platforms that offer applicants tracking system, and that aids in a shortlisting process. The recruitment process also has been impacted by the pandemic, and now interviews are virtual. Today we're using more referrals and headhunting companies. And key positions may be filled through this method, mainly senior positions. And then you have your behavioral assessment tools that you incorporate to determine best fit for the organization. And of course, for your internal recruits, we would identify candidates who would have gone through various developmental leadership programs that would have demonstrated the skills and attitudes for the required position. But let me go a step further. You know, you used to have old style interview questions, and then you now have a new type of interview question. So before you would ask a question, tell me about yourself. Today you ask someone to say, walk me through your resume and tell me how your experience would make you suitable for the position based on the requirements of the job and the technical abilities. So that's a difference right there. And today also, both sets of parties are interested in impressing each other, not just the candidate to the employee, but the employer also has to sell themselves for the position to attract persons.
Yeah, Charmaine, that's one of the things that in our opening I was discussing, that it's no longer where you have an interviewee who is looking to impress an employer, but it's vice versa. I shouldn't say vice versa, but it's equal, because the employer now is trying to equally impress the employee to say yes to their offer, right?
Correct.
That wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. It was almost as if the employee, the candidate, went in there begging, but now there's sort of equal begging.
You're correct. In fact, the playing field, very true, the playing field has shifted. The candidates have done more research on the companies. They want to see how are companies retaining and engaging their employees when they're there. How do you motivate employees? What are you offering inside? How flexible are you? What do you do as engagement activities? And the culture fit and best fit now comes into play.
You know, one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, we actually touched on it lightly, but if you could expand on it, I'm very familiar with personality assessment tests and all of these different programs that are out there now to really see for an employer to gauge whether or not this person, who on the surface, based on the academics of a resume, looks like they're a good fit, but are they a good fit for the culture of the company? Is their personality going to be a missing piece, or they're going to be sort of an antithesis to the culture? How important is that now for interviewers to assess the personality of that individual?
Great question, Jay, and very relevant and applicant, because during the interviews, you have different types of interviews: behavioral-based techniques, competency-based, situational, brain teasers, all various types. But the personality assessment is key because culture fit is very important. And techniques where you employ personality tests, such as your DISC, is very important at the point of selection, because that gives a employer insight into the personality and how they would fit into the team, and then how the manager, once employed to that team, can coach, mentor, guide based on their personality, and if they're a fit, to the team based on the assessment of the rest of the team with that DISC assessment, as a for instance. So that's very important, because it gives a great feel for, would that person be willing to immerse themselves in the culture of the organization? And culture immersion is very key in the first few months of onboarding, participation.
Charmaine, that's great information that you have shared. I want to look at it from a different perspective now. What are the 3 to 5 things people do wrong in the interviewing process?
Thanks for that question, Laura. The main thing that persons do wrong is not researching the company that they're interviewing with in advance. So they're unprepared. They're unable to market their current skills in relationship to the position that they're going after, and to see how those skills correlate. And the worst thing you can do is coming into an interview where the panel recognizes that you have not done the homework regarding the job description, the company profile, who does what and where, and what the company does and where do they sit in the society. Very important to be prepared. Do the research.
And also, this is good for our listeners to hear and to understand, because oftentimes they think just showing up on time, having a good resume is all they really need, but there's far more to it to be successful. The other thing I wanted to ask now is, how can a candidate who was successful in the interview achieve success on the job? Because getting the job is one thing. Keeping the job is another.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier, immersion, participating in organization events, volunteering to be a part of the ecosystem, having an understanding of the job and the key performance indicators. So, and on the flip side, the employer has an obligation for ensuring training, coaching, mentoring to ensure success of the person in the role. So a robust onboarding orientation process to ensure that the new employee has an understanding and appreciation of the culture of the organization is also important. But for the employee, participation in organizational events, volunteering, and immersion in the culture is very important, in addition to what I mentioned before.
Very true. Thanks for that, Charmaine.
Charmaine, it's interesting. My daughter is 24 years old, and when she started to look for work, one of the things I would say to her was, be careful what you are putting on social media. Watch the posts, watch the comments, because these days employers will dive deep into someone's social media sites. They'll see what they're posting, they'll see what kind of personality, what kind of brand they're building. Because whether you know it or not, and I don't think young people, or even anyone who really is new to the social media exposure, what you post, what you comment, what you like, to the observer already puts you in a particular box. They categorize you as this or that kind of person. And what you might say in front of an employer or potential employer in an interview, and the persona you try to present yourself as may not be the person who they see when they check you out on your social media site, right? So
excellent advice.
Right?
Go ahead. Yes.
So obviously it's important to monitor your social media and your personal brand. How important is that from your perspective and what you hear and see, for someone to understand the importance of, hey, I got to check myself out on my media postings and on my personal brand as well?
Excellent advice to your daughter, Jay. Your personal brand and your social media activity and representation of yourself is so important. Candidates represent themselves and their value systems on the social media, and we go on as recruitment persons, recruiters, companies, to assess how you represent yourself on social media. And let me tell you, I could tell you some stories with persons with what they have posted. And in so doing, where we would have shortlisted, they would have been removed from the shortlist because that brand is not what we want within the business. And during employment as well, too, Jay, I'll go a step further. Mm-hmm. In a previous capacity, we have had to separate employees because of what was posted on social media, because it could be easily correlated to the company and the company's brand. So that's also very important, not just for recruitment, but for current employment, to maintain your employment as well.
Yeah, and there's two comments that I could make here, Charmaine. I think both of them are really appropriate to this. I was at one time doing recruiting, and to an extent, I still do recruiting for our companies. But years ago, I remember I was recruiting on one of the career resume I won't give the name of that platform, but it's a website that you could go and search resumes. And I got so discouraged looking at some of these resumes because what was written on the resume, when I got these folks on the phone, this is without even meeting them. When I got them on the phone, Charmaine, I was wondering, is this the same person on the resume? It doesn't jive with the person who they say they are on paper, but the person who comes across on the phone, it was questionable. But what was funny about one of them was there was a resume. It was wonderful, wonderfully written, great words. I thought to myself, wow, what a great candidate. And when I went down to look at the contact information, you guys are going to find this funny. When I went down to the contact information, it gave her name and her phone number. And here's where she dropped the ball, where she gave it all away, her personality, the kind of person she is. You ready for her email? Yeah. You ready? This is her email. This is somebody who was looking for work. Her resume was Big Top Mama at Yahoo.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
I thought to myself, these candidates, they just shoot themselves in the foot one way or another. You have to uphold your brand all the way through, even to your email address, which is so important. And I thought that was it was sad but it was funny. But it was, boy, that was tragic for that person. I don't know who would have ended up hiring her. But what's the best way today? There's lots of ways to hunt for work, hunt for something that brings you passion. What would you advise the job seeker to incorporate as one of their job hunting tactics?
You know, Jay, that's a good question. And there is no right or wrong way for job hunting today. Networking and social media, of course, are great methodologies, as is the traditional ways of looking at the career listings and the advertisements. You have to incorporate all avenues, because all of those, the networking, the social media, looking on the career listings, the newsprints, all work and will give you different aspects and avenues that you can then follow up. But your networking, you have to work at that and expand that in a way that is different these days also. Every opportunity for networking should be expanded and should be capitalized on.
Very good. Very
yes.
good.
And Charmaine, as a brand consultant, it's so important. You know, people, it's important to know that how you look, write, and interact with others, maybe all a person sees of your brand. And as you mentioned before, it's important to align your brand with the organization's brand in order to keep the job and continue to achieve success. And especially in a world that's extremely competitive, you know, the candidates are coming and they're doing their research and they're serious about their career. And that's what you're up against. So it's so important to be mindful of that. The other question I have for you is, what are your recommendations for an interviewee that's going through the process to make a positive impression on the interviewer?
Great question, Laura. You know, when a candidate goes through the process with you and you go through a panel interview and it lasts an hour or 45 minutes, whatever the time frame is, you have to leave that panel or that interviewer with an understanding of your strengths and how you have marketed and translated those skills for the job and for the company, and what value you would bring to the organization. You have to leave the interview with those three things: your strengths, what you bring to the organization, and what those skills are and how they bring value.
Charmaine, in this very competitive world too, it's important to understand that the world is a small place, and that's what technology has done. It's so easy to find out, you know, information on people. The first thing you do when you meet someone is you'll probably Google them. And, you know, of course, here in the United States and just about everywhere, you know, there's a background check. And it's important for people to know that, especially as there are so many candidates that are serious about their career, doing their research, coming prepared, and that's what you're up against. So you need to be serious about your career and what you can do to put yourself at an advantage. So Charmaine, the next question I have is the role of HR is not an easy one, but it's such an important one. It's really the foundation for any organization. And can you share with us what are some of the challenges you have experienced in managing staff? And what are some of your suggestions as to how to address them?
Laura, that's a very good question. And in this business of HR, you're talking about people and their lives, people and work lives, people and their family lives. When you talk about that, you talk about how you manage conflicts within the team. I spoke about the DISC, which helps you to navigate, once you have assessed your teams, how to manage them based on what the DISC personality says. Keeping team members motivated is something that you have to ensure that you do in management. Keeping persons engaged so that you maintain high productivity levels. How do you manage performance concerns is also one of the things you have to ensure that you tackle constantly. Feedback, coaching, mentoring, making sure you use various team building interventions to build, motivate, and engage your teams. Communication is paramount to ensure that your communication is very a very clearly defined strategic element in your work environment. Constant communication, open communication, top-down and bottom-up communication is critical. In addition to that, making sure that clearly defined goals, SMART goals and objectives are in place for your employees. And lastly, but not least, is making sure that you create an environment for work-life balance for your staff. Very important today.
Yes.
Well, always important, but very important.
Yes, I was about to hit on that because especially in today's day and age where stress is such a big issue, there are companies now implementing a mental health day. Where
correct.
People can call in and request that. I think that's important to monitor, and as you rightly said, the balance,
Yes.
One of the things that I've noticed, even as I've out and about working with employers and businesses and for the last 20 plus years, Charmaine, is the improvements that has occurred between employees and employers over the last even 5 or 10 years. What are some of the continuing improvements that you see happening so that employees and employers could have a much better environment and obviously a much better working experience?
Jay, that's a good question too. Employers are constantly having to innovate and to ensure retention strategies because to keep staff engaged, it's something that is almost a division by itself, staff engagement, to ensure that you are doing things innovatively to create that engagement, because both parties are more aware of their rights and the communication has improved. Organizations are not as hierarchical, and you have to really listen to what those needs are. So the communication strategies that I spoke about before also has to include engagement strategies to ensure that the engagement is there. And that engagement speaks to training for staff, because employees, when you listen to them, they want to see a career path being developed for themselves. It's not just about the work today when you hire them. It's about what can I get and where can I go within this organization. So you have to make sure that that career pathing, the training, the mentoring, what they can receive and grow and develop during the progression of time is very clearly defined for them.
Wonderful. And you're absolutely right, by the way. Employee engagement is almost another whole division today that has to be created, if it's not created already, by companies. And by the way, one of the things that I would encourage employers to consider is incorporating into their training or in their programming how to avoid employee burnout. We could probably do a whole podcast on that, right? Employee
Most
burnout.
Definitely. Most definitely.
And how are we addressing employee burnout? And not just employee burnout, directorial burnout, manager burnout, CEO burnout. Everyone focuses on the employee. Well, when there's a burnout conversation, the focus tends to be on the employee when there is a focus at all. But there's very little focus that is given to those at the higher executive levels who experience probably equal amount of burnout, if not 10x more,
Yes.
because they hold so much more responsibility. But again, that's a conversation for probably another podcast.
Yes. And, Charmaine, the companies that are doing exceptionally well are companies that invest in training. And one of the things candidates also look for, certainly I encourage them to do, is look for a company that invests in the growth and development of the employees, because it's one thing to get the job, but of course every organization is now going to train them according to the culture, and to ensure they're in line with their brand and their goals and all of that. So training is a huge part of organization success.
Most definitely, Laura. Staff training, as I mentioned before, is critical for employee engagement and retention. And companies that have a separate division for training, online training, face-to-face training, but career pathing for each area of the business are those that are successful also. And we also have to ensure that the persons who we recruit, they have the drive and the passion for self-development and growth, because let's face it, your development and growth is your responsibility. Yes. The environment and the company will provide opportunities for you should you so desire and seek it, but your responsibility as an employee and as an individual is to go after it.
Absolutely, Charmaine. I'm glad you stated that, because sometimes the employee will put a lot of pressure on the employer without taking initiative and responsibility for their own growth and success. So that is important for them to know as well. Thank you for that, Charmaine.
Charmaine, you've been an absolute treat having you on the show today. We could actually, and I think most of our listeners would agree, this is a conversation that can actually take another hour, hour and a half. And we're going to have you back in the future, because there are so many more other areas that are vital to speak about in this very important topic. It really is the lifeblood of the success of a company. HR plays a major part of that. So we're going to have you back again in the future. But I appreciate you being on the show today and bringing so much value.
Thank you so much, Jay, for saying that. It was my pleasure to be here to share my thoughts with yourself and Laura, and I would be happy to return anytime. I'm at your convenience.
Great, Charmaine. I would like to wish you continued success. You're excellent at what you do. It's always an honor to work with you. And, I know that you'll continue to do amazing things for your organization and the people that you're responsible for. So best of luck.
Thank you. All the best to you too.
Laura, we could have spent, as I said earlier, we could have spent another hour, hour and a half having a conversation, digging deeper into this content, because it's so important. So I'm serious when I said that we should have Charmaine back in the future to continue to dive into what becomes a healthy environment, what becomes a healthy interview process, what should a candidate be focusing on, because this is going to continue to evolve from here on in.
Yes, and it's so important, especially in today's day and age, where it's so competitive, and finding good candidates is so important. So excellent interview and great information from the perspective of the employee, employer, and the organization on a whole.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for listening. Keep safe and focused. Until next time, I'm Laura Butler.
And I'm Jay Mamie. And just make sure that you can look us up on the podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. You will also find us on iHeartRadio, Podcast Chaser, and of course, right here on the ucc.edu.jm website. Until then, we're your hosts. I'm Jay Mamie with Laura. We'll see you next time.